Good afternoon, brethren. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. And I hope, given the circumstances that everybody's enduring with the pandemic, and if you're in the Bay Area, some of the challenges that the fire is presenting, I hope you're doing well and that you're able to relax and engage this Sabbath. The pandemic and the fires, depending on where you're at, have caused a little bit of chaos in our lives. They've caused us to change our routine and structure, introduced that with that chaos, a little bit of uncertainty that we're all dealing with. And it's interesting as we go through and we think about our lives and we think about where we're at now, the situation that we're in with the amount of chaos and maybe a little bit of anxiety and a little uncertainty mixed in actually parallels a time in Scripture. I think it's worthwhile to revisit, to consider. Because when we consider Israel as they were leaving Egypt, there was a time as the people were entering into the promised land. Joshua had just died. And as the people stood there looking out at the vision that had been laid out for them, the promise that God had made for them, there was a change. And they knew there was a change. Things were different. It's not like it was before. Up to that time, God had used two people very, very powerfully, both Moses and Joshua, to lead the people. And while those individuals weren't perfect, they were men of God. They were led by God to guide and direct the people very powerfully. And because of the example that they had lived, because of who they were and their connection to God, the people looked to them. They looked to them for guidance and leadership. But as they stood, after they'd already entered the land and they've already had God's blessing and his power to guide them to begin taking over the land that had been promised, there was a change. There was no Moses. There was no Joshua. The people stood there and their future was based on their relationship with God. And God had prepared them for this time. He had worked with the people for the previous 100 some odd years. He had worked with them. He had guided and directed them. He had taught them. This was a time that he was anticipating, that he wanted a relationship directly with his people. He wanted to be their leader and their ruler. He wanted there to be a relationship directly with his people as he would guide and direct them as they would continue to take over the land to fulfill the promise that had been given. And their cohesion, their unity as a people, their unity as a nation was defined as a result of their relationship with him, as a result of their connection to him. That's what had been prepared for the people. And as he prepared them for this time, to help support them, he gave them structures. He gave them a priesthood that would continue to teach. He gave them laws, statutes, and judgments to understand how to live the way of life that he had outlined, to engage with him, to continue to build and grow on that. He'd given them a family structure where the parents were firmly connected to God and the children then were connected to the parents, so that you had a family that was thoroughly connected in their relationship to the Father. He had spent almost 100 years working with the people as they had come out of Egypt. And so it's interesting when we look back at the situation that they were in to consider what happened after one generation. One generation after Joshua passed away, after Joshua died. What happened to the people? And we find that in Judges chapter 2. If you could turn with me to Judges chapter 2. It's an interesting statement that we see here, beginning in verse 7. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, that one generation, who had seen all the great works of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. There was remembrance, there was a connection, there was an understanding. Dropping down to verse 10. And when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, when they died, another generation arose after them, who did not know the Lord their God, or the work which he had done for Israel. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord their God, the Lord of the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods among the gods of the people who were all around them. They bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. You know, when we read that, because we have the view of history, it's almost shocking. It's a little bit stunning that in one generation, after God had interacted with the people so powerfully, just one generation, the people forgot. But that in and of itself is not that unique. You know, one of the challenges that the people of God have is that they forget. You know, we see Paul writing in Galatians that he was amazed at how soon the people had forgotten God and forgotten the gospel that was once delivered to them. We see in Jude, where Jude, you know, encourages the brethren to remember the faith that was once delivered. Remember that calling. And why? You know, why did he ask them to remember? Why did he encourage that? Because they were forgetting, and other people were coming in and they were perverting the truth. They were perverting the gospel. So it's not interesting. I mean, it's not unique from the perspective that the people forgot. It's unfortunately something that we see throughout Scripture. What is unique, though, with this case of Israel, as they were leaving Egypt, or going into, not leaving, but as they were going into the promised land, was that we have this recorded so that we can look at it and understand what happened. You know, why did they forget God so quickly? What was it that went on? What did they miss? What happened? And given where we are, brethren, in the midst of chaos, when the routines and structures of our life have kind of been adjusted, changed, modified, in many cases completely wiped out. And as we set these routines in our life and we think about how we're going to structure our life, it's good for us also to think about the same thing. So what did happen? If you could turn over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 6, you know, we do see an insight that we just read in Judges chapter 2 with regard to what some of that problem was. You know, think about what we read in verses 11, verses 13. The people forgot. They didn't remember. And, you know, we can think about what that looks like in our own life. One of the things that God wanted for the people, and one of the things he spent a tremendous amount of time working with the people on, was how to structure their life, how to build their life around him, how to create that connection with him. You know, he had miraculously and powerfully intervened time after time. He had shown them his power. You know, he had shown them, and he had given them object examples, some that we'll touch on, with regard to how to build that life, their life around him, and to create that connection with him. And he did all of this because he wanted the people to construct their lives around him. Because when we build and construct our lives around God, when we ensure that connection, there's remembrance. And when the community as a whole, all the members of that community, build their life around God and ensure that connection, the community creates a shared heritage. And when that shared heritage is based on the relationship with God, and that is handed down from generation to generation, the people share a shared heritage. They share that heritage that is defined by their relationship with God. And when they do that, they remember. So as God was working with Israel, he obviously understood that there was an opportunity for them to forget. And so as they entered into the promised land and started their sojourn, one of the things that he talked to them about was what they needed to think about as they were going into the land. And that's where we move to Deuteronomy chapter 6. You know, the whole first half of the chapter or so in Deuteronomy 6 is really about building and structuring our life around God. We'll begin in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 1, where we read, "Now this is the commandment And these are the statutes and the judgment which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you're choosing to cross, which you're crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, you and your son and your grandson, all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. You know, it's interesting. There is a clear expectation that God has of his people, that his way of life will be taught and passed down to generation, so as not to forget him and his way of life, what they're called to. But there's something more. God expects each generation, as they engage and build their lives around him and create that relationship, that he expects each generation to be a link. And that whenever the community links together, it creates this shared heritage and it creates this common unity based on this relationship, so that the community remembers. And each successive generation, as this heritage and this connection is shared, continues to grow. And the community remembers. They don't forget. Continuing in verse 6, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk about them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. You know, building a life of God, around God, requires that we put him at the absolute center of our existence. Everything that we do, everything that we focus on, who we are as individuals, needs to connect back to him. As we're with family and friends, as we go around living our lives, as we go to work, as we think about it, as we go to church, when we engage with friends and family, God is a prominent topic. He's always there. We're always connecting back to him. And we structure our life so that as we live our life, there are these connection points where we constantly come back around and connect to him, so that we're never that far away from him, that our thought process and our engagement is close to him. And we build routines, we build thought processes, we structure literally our life around him. But why is it so important that we do that? What is it about it that's so important that we build our life and the connection and the routines in our life to connect to him on a consistent basis? Verse 10, so it shall be when the Lord your God brings you into the land of which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac and Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. And when you have eaten and are full, then beware, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. You know, the problem is that we as human beings are beings of routine. We crave routine in our life. We create structures and routines and processes to make sense out of how to live our life, how to structure it so that we eliminate the chaos and we can add some certainty to our life. And the problem is if we don't structure the routines in our life so that they constantly bring us back into a connection with God. We build routines that aren't connected. And as we build those routines and we live in those routines, over time, we start to step away. And the insidious part about that whole process is that it's not intentional. It just happens. If we don't intentionally build and structure our life so that we are constantly coming back into contact with him, like he was explaining here in Deuteronomy 6, then what we end up with is a path that slowly separates us from him. And over time, that's what we find with Israel. They didn't structure the routines in their life to constantly bring them back into contact with him, that he was the focus and the forefront of their mind. And we think about our lives now. We've gone through a period in the pandemic where many of the routines in our life have been wiped out, been changed. Many of us are working from home. Some have been furloughed. Some have lost their jobs. The Sabbath day, we don't keep the way that we had 6 months ago. We unfortunately, in many areas, we're not able to attend services. Fortunately, we do have the opportunity to connect through Zoom. But if we think about school and life, how we get groceries, can we even go to the doctor? When do we go to the doctor? All those things have changed. The way that we would live our life has been restructured. So as we're thinking about these processes and we're reevaluating and resetting up some of these routines in our life, it's a good time to stop and think. Are we building these routines around our Father? Are we building them in such a way that we're coming into contact with God? So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to shift the message a little bit. I'd like to look at a couple of examples quickly that show how God worked with Israel to help them understand the need and how to build these routines and processes in their life so that He was at the center of who and what they were to sustain that remembrance and that connection. So the first object lesson that He taught Israel that I'd like to spend a little time with is how the camp was structured. So we think about where Israel was when they left Egypt. Israel had been enmeshed and been surrounded by the worship and the system of power and influence that was Egypt. When they looked at how people built their lives around their gods, it was Egyptian. When they looked at how they connected back to those gods, it was Egyptian. They had forgotten much of their heritage. When they came out, God had to teach them through the giving of manna, which day is the Sabbath and how do you begin to keep the Sabbath? It was an object lesson. But one of the things that is really important that God did when He started working with Israel is He taught them how to structure the camp. And it was an object lesson for how they were to structure their lives. So if you could turn over with me to Numbers chapter 2. So how did they structure their camp? Numbers chapter 2 and verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, the sons of Israel shall camp, each by his own standard, with the banners of their fathers and their households. And they shall camp around the tent of meeting at a distance. So when we think about how the camp was structured, in the middle, you had the tabernacle. And then around the tabernacle, you had the Levites, Aaron, Moses, the priests, and they served as a barrier so that the people wouldn't go through and get and ultimately move to a place that they weren't supposed to be, to protect the barrier. And then you had the tribes of Israel then surrounding the Levites, Moses, Aaron, and the priest. And all of the people were focused in on the tabernacle. They were focused in God's dwelling. And we also see in Exodus chapter 40 and verse 38 that the cloud of the Lord was on the temple by day, and the pillar of fire was on it by night. So think about the object lesson that presented for Israel. When they got up in the morning and they went to gather their food, the manna that God gave, which was a miracle because God was sustaining their life, what was the first thing they saw? It was the pillar of fire if they got up before sunup. It was a pillar of cloud if they got up after. What about when they went around their daily routines? When they went to see their friends, or they went to to go build this or build that, or they went here or there. There was a constant reminder of the pillar of cloud, pillar of fire. What about at night? When they were done with the day and they went into their tent, what was the last thing that they saw? Pillar of the cloud, pillar of fire. If they went from the camp and they wanted to find their way back, how did they find their way back? When they were walking around at night, where did they get the light? God was enmeshed in absolutely every part of their life. And as they lived their routines, as they went through and they structured out the things that they would do every day, it was constantly coming into contact with God. He was pervasive in their life. What about us? As we structure our routines the way we live, as we think about setting up our life, do we ensure that we have connections to our God throughout the day on a constant basis? So we're always coming back into contact with Him. We're always having that connection and strengthening that connection to Him. You know, we can think of our life as being on a spectrum. On one end of our life, we can approach it like, I'm going to set up my life and I'm going to kind of set up my routines. I'm going to decide that I'm going to do A, B, and C, and I'm going to go around and do these things. And now I finally have my life structured, and how am I going to live it? And then it's like, oh yeah, God, let me put you over here on this part. You know, so we kind of structure our life and then look for a place to insert Him in it. On the other end of that spectrum, we put Him at the absolute center. Our choices, our decisions, the things that we do, the things we choose not to do, and how we do those things. We constantly look to provide that connection back to Him so that throughout our day, we're coming into contact with Him. We're thinking about Him. We're prayerfully approaching Him all day long. When we think about how we approach leadership in our job, how we interact with our neighbors, how we interact with our family and our children, is He that pervasive being that we're seeking that connection with? Or do we live our life and simply look for a place for Him to connect to? The example that He left for Israel was that He wanted to be at the center, and that He wanted the people to structure their lives around Him so that there would be connection, and that there would be a heritage, a shared heritage, and an identity of a people that was based on the relationship with who and what He was, what He is, so that they don't forget. But they forgot. You know, another example that we can think about is a Sabbath day. You know, we read in Exodus 20, if you could turn over there, but we read in Exodus 20, we're instructed to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You know, it's interesting the way that God phrased that commandment, because after we consider the context that we're discussing here today, there's an intention that we structure our life and how we approach the keeping of the Sabbath in such a way that we don't forget it. It's not just about showing up to services or joining Zoom for an hour and a half or 2 hours a day, on the Sabbath day. That's not what He intends from keeping the Sabbath. We read in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And in it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your maidservant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea and all that's in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So considering the context of the discussion of God's intention of remembrance and structuring our lives around Him, structuring the way that we live our lives, a couple of points. We're expected to work, to engage in accomplishment and valuable activities for ourselves and others throughout the week for 6 days. We're expected to work. But we view the week as we are moving towards the Sabbath. And we can see in Mark 15 and John 19 that Friday, or the day before the Sabbath, is a preparation day. So we're working, preparing, adding value, living the way of life that God has given us up to the preparation day. And as we get to the preparation day, we begin to prepare to keep the Sabbath. You know, we remove and we do all those routine or mundane things that we can from the Sabbath day to the preparation day, so that we are prepared then on the Sabbath to engage in a holy time with our God that is unique among the week. It is a unique day among the week, and we have an opportunity to have an intimate, connected, intense time with our Father that we can't have the rest of the week. But we have to prepare. We have to build the routines in our life so that we come to the Sabbath, we are prepared to engage with Him in that intimate conversation, in the intimate connection that we have with Him. And when we do that as individuals, and when we do that as a community, we remember the Sabbath day. We understand it, we engage, and that also becomes a part of our identity of a people who are connected to God. You know, brethren, we look around us now, there is chaos. Our routines and the way that we live our life has kind of been thrown up. It's come to change, right? The way that we lived 6-7 months ago in many ways has been wiped out, and we're establishing these new routines in our life. And as we think about the connection that we have with our Father and His desire for us to remember and to build our lives around Him, to create this connection, to create this shared heritage, to create the link among the community where we come together and share this heritage that is based from an identity perspective on our connection to Him and who and what He is. We have a choice. We can kind of build our life and figure out where He fits in. Or we can build our life around Him as He sits in the absolute center of our life. And as we build these routines and as we look to restructure routines in our life that have been nullified or removed or changed, we build that connection and maintain that foundation and strength of that relationship with Him. Let's go forward, brethren, and let's build a strong, connected relationship with Him. Let's remember.